Okay, folks, it's 1:15. We'll get started here pretty shortly. Wait for my my co-host to show up here, Dave Stevenson. Hey, Dave.
Hey.
Perfect. All right, so folks, we're going to get going on the next topic, which falls under the next theme, which is climate change and carbon. We are lucky enough today to have Dave Stevenson with us. He's Director of Canadian Operations for the Finite Carbon Canada, and he's going to be chatting with us about carbon. So, Dave, I'll turn it over to you. I'm going to quietly sneak into the shadows of the background here, and I'll let you start sharing your presentation. All right.
All right. Thanks so much, Hudson. And we'll just manage this. Give me a second here. And let's see, slideshow. From the beginning. Okay, so Hudson, maybe you can just give me the A-OK that you've got what you should see in front. Okay, right on.
It's just PowerPoint. It's not showing your main presentation, Mike.
Oh, gosh. Of course it isn't. Okay, let me just try that again.
Yeah, stop sharing, open her up, and start your slideshow, then share.
No, I've got the wrong one. Okay. You know, it doesn't matter how many times you do this, folks. It's always something different. So we'll try this again. And here we are. Allow from the beginning. How's that?
Again, that's just the PowerPoint. Do you want me just to put on the presentation, run through your
slides?
Yeah,
why don't you do that? I don't know why it's not working for me, although we tested this out just like not even 2 seconds ago. So I'll stop sharing and you can just.
There we go. You just tell me when I want to go to the next slide and I got her.
Sounds good. Okay, great. Awesome, folks. Well, I'm here to talk about forest carbon and forest carbon offsets and why I believe forest carbon is the new forest product. So next slide, please. I'll give you a bit of an introduction about myself and who Finite Carbon is, talk a little bit about the regulatory landscape. I'm going to give you a quick overview on how forest carbon offset protocols work, talk a little bit about the difference between public and private land, and then speak to some of the market drivers and projections, and then finally make my final argument that forest carbon is a forest product. So next slide, please. So a little bit about me. I started in forestry in the 80s as a tree planter, got my degree at Lakehead, worked in Thunder Bay for KBM, doing a whole pile of stuff with them. Spent 10 years with the Saskatchewan Forest Service doing forest policy, forest renewal, and forest management planning. 4 years ago now, I started a new job with the Environment Climate Change branch, doing as Director of Climate Change Policy and Programs, implementing their their climate change regulations and act. So the province really had nothing prior to that, but at the end of that period, we had over 15,000 facilities regulated, much like it's done in Alberta as well. And then in January of this year, I started as Director of Finite Carbon. The Canadian operations was launched in Canada. Next slide, please. So who are we? I mean, we're a forestry company with a focus on forest carbon. We're North America's leading developer and supplier of forest carbon offsets. We were founded in 2009 with our head office in Pennsylvania. We have about 40 staff, about half of which are foresters. We're very niche. All we do is forest carbon offsets. We don't develop projects for any other type of offset protocol, just forest carbon. Next, if you want to click forward. So we are owned by BP. They bought us a majority stake in the company in December of last year, and we launched our Canadian operations in 2021 in Edmonton. Click away. And we are involved with the CCAB as a member there. We're actually the smallest company in their folder. But our company, if you click to the next slide, we have a number of projects spread across the U.S. We're in conversations with lots of landowners in Canada about ongoing projects. So there'll be some dots a bit north of the border shortly. But we've sold over 89 million tons of offsets, and that's generated in excess of $800 million in US dollars in revenue to landowners. And those really are roughly categorized in four major groups: land trusts and nonprofits, corporate owners of land in the States, TMOs and REITs, and then of course the biggest part of our business is working with First Nations and tribes and Alaska Native corporations in the US. Next slide, please. So what is the regulatory picture in Canada? You know, you can see the map of the states. It's got lots of projects on it, and that's a result of having a regulatory framework that's existed for the past 10 years. But Canada's regulatory framework is evolving. And what you have on the landscape is pretty diverse. So there's the federal regulation, which is known as the federal OBPS. This is the output-based performance system, is what it's called. And there are provinces that also have industrial regulation similar to the feds. And typically they're sort of categorized in that OBPS kind of moniker. What an OBPS does is large industrial emitters are exempted from the carbon tax on fuels, but are required to reduce their emissions on their facilities. And I'll explain a little bit more about how that works in our next slide. There are other systems out there. There's a cap and trade system that applies in Quebec and Nova Scotia, and then BC has a bit of a different twist on it. They apply the carbon tax on fuels to every facility and every person, and so depending on where you are in Canada, you'll either have a federal OBPS that applies or a provincial OBPS that applies. Next slide, please. So how does it work? So the federal government has what they call the backstop legislation. It's known as the Greenhouse Gas Pricing Pollution Act. And this has an annual assessment of provincial regulations against the federal benchmark. So what they do is basically they say, here's what you have to do, you know, province, and they'll assess your program to see if it meets those standards. If you don't meet those standards, they will impose their legislation, which is essentially what's happened in Manitoba. Manitoba's program doesn't meet the federal standards, so the federal government imposed their system. In Alberta, it's a bit of a split. Alberta doesn't have a carbon tax on fuels, so the federal government imposed the carbon tax on fuels, but they do have industrial regulation, and the federal government accepted that. And that industrial regulation is known as TIER. And it's been in place in various different names. It seems to switch with somewhat regularity. But they've had Alberta's had an OBPS type system since 2007. That's important because the way it works is a facility is required to reduce its emissions. And if it can't, then it has to pay what they can't reduce in tons at the current compliance price. That's that carbon price that we keep talking about. Next year, it'll be $50. Currently, it's $40. The switch happens in December. Or they can purchase offsets. And this is where offsets come into the picture as part of that regulatory market. So emitters that cannot meet their emission standards have the option of either paying into a fund, they have the option of buying offsets, or they have the option of buying what are known as emission performance credits from facilities that are overperforming. Those overperforming facilities are able to sell those credits. So you've got a number of options, but that's how offsets fit into the mix in a regulatory market. For forestry purposes, there is a forestry offset protocol in development for private lands in Alberta. And Finite Carbon and myself, we're leading that process. We're hoping to have that ready for draft early in the new year. Next slide, please. What else is out on the landscape? Well, there's the BC Carbon Offset Protocol. Well, I had the slide says due late 2021. It's actually likely going to be released in Q1 of 2022. And the project lengths can range from 125 to 200 years, depending on what choices are made within the protocol. And it's you can actually buy offsets from a previous version of the forest carbon offset protocol on the BC Carbon Registry right now if you wanted to. It's not tied to the carbon price, so pricing tends to be a bit lower. The American Carbon Registry just released its methodology for Canada. It was approved in September of this year, and it has a project length of about 40 years. There are other methodologies out there. There's a Vera, Canadian Forest Carbon Offset methodology that's being used, and a few others. But the ACR, American Carbon Improved Forest Management, is in the U.S. by far the dominant methodology used on private lands. Next slide, please. Okay, well, this graph should come as no surprise to anyone. If you've ever done any forest management planning or growth and yield, you've seen curves like this before. But it's also illustrative of what the carbon landscape is on a landscape over time as well. So, you know, the stem volume per hectare is equivalent to the carbon volume per hectare. Roughly, it gives you a sense of when you're going to have your most carbon, when you want to put a project in, when you don't want to put a project in. And so, you know, your timing of choosing a landscape for a project is important as well. Clearly, on the back end of that tail, sort of up at 120, 130 years in a deciduous forest, you're losing carbon. It's not a good mix for a carbon project. A good mix is in the sort of that front end where MAI is increasing rapidly to its peak. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a quick description of how these things work. It's a bit of a complicated slide, so you'll have to just bear with me on this one. Next click will bring up a couple more graphs. There we are. Okay, great. So there are two sources of crediting that you would find on a forest carbon project. The first one is that top line. That one is very intuitive. As foresters, we've been doing this forever. It's measuring the growth of the trees, and those are known as new or removal credits. So, you know, you can go out there every day of the year, measure the tree, and get a pretty solid estimate of how much it's grown over time. So that's one aspect of an IFM, an improved forest management project, is capturing the growth and turning that into carbon offsets. The second part's a little bit more difficult to kind of wrap one's head around, and that is it's what you're not doing on the landscape that you get credit for. So it's sort of counterintuitive argument. By putting a project in a carbon, putting a piece of land in a carbon project, you're not harvesting that forest, or you're not liquidating that forest, or you're not harvesting it aggressively. And so what the protocols and the methodologies do is they estimate what you could have done if you were maximizing net present value on the landscape. And that red curve would show the drop in carbon stocks over time if you were using a net present value approach to harvesting your forest. Now, of course, that's not what you're doing. What you're doing is you're not harvesting your forest for net present value, but you can get credit for the delta between what you could have done and what you are doing. And so that's represented in that orange triangle under the red line on that first reporting period. So for the first year, you would get credit for, excuse me, for the tons of carbon that have grown on the landscape, and that's a small triangle at the top. And then you'd also get credit for what you're not doing on the landscape. Now, there's all sorts of limitations on that, and riders that would move that line up or down, the red line up or down, and create a different slope on it. Some of those include, what covenants might be on the land. Maybe you've got a requirement to not harvest near a road or a lake or a stream. Maybe you've got a requirement that part of the landscape is under a deed or an easement or something like that. Or maybe there's not enough mill capacity in the area, to accept all the wood from that project in year one. So you got to sort of schedule it out over a number of years. But the bottom line is that at the end of the day, it's a modeled exercise that sort of estimates landowner behavior, and that's always a difficult thing to do. The critiques of IFM protocols are typically on this part of it, on the avoided emission side of the protocol. Everyone agrees that removals is pretty intuitive and can be measured directly. The counterintuitive process of estimating landowner behavior is where critiques have. And that's actually reflected in the market. New removal credits are actually priced higher than avoided emission credits, even within forestry protocols. Next slide, please, or next click. I'm not sure where this is going to go. Yeah, so you can see in your RP2, you get a little bit less in the avoided emission, and you get growth proportion, and that's what your crediting would be for year 2. And then if you click further on, you'll see year 3, and I think that's it. So next slide, please. Okay, so what are the cardinal rules about carbon? Well, whatever you had at the start of that project has to be there at the end of the project. That's what creates that permanence feature of a carbon offset project. Of course, the next question is, well, what about wildfires, right? Yes, wildfires do occur on the landscape, and they are actually accounted for in a risk assessment within the protocol itself. So if, for example, you had a piece of land that had 1,000 tons of carbon on it, you would not get credit for 1,000 tons because it's discounted for that risk proportion to take a bunch of credits away and put them in what's known as a buffer pool. And the buffer pools have different names depending on the registry or the systems being used. But essentially what they are is an insurance scheme. So you chip in a little bit of your tons, and should your piece of land burn, then the tons that have been chipped in across the entire landscape pay for the losses on that piece. Additionality is the other thing as well. A fundamental rule of offsets is whatever you're getting credit for has to be over and above what would have happened anyway, that business as usual case. And so that additionality has to be, additional to legal requirements, additional to financial occurrences. So would you have done this project anyway? Or is the carbon revenue what's going to help you achieve a project on a piece of land? Are there rules in place that require you to keep your forest in standing? If that's the case, then a carbon project can't be given because it's not additional. And then there are these concepts of leakage. If you had a piece of land and you put it in a carbon project, is the forest company just going to go down the road and cut somewhere else? And to some degree they do, but not 100%, and that leakage calculation is also deducted from that total carbon on the landscape and is reflected in your net issuance of credits. Next slide, please. Okay, so what about private versus public land? Okay, well, we'll start with public land. Offset protocols for operating on public land need to consider that legal additionality. And so, when you think about legal additionality, you think about the Act, the Forests Act, timber management regulations, your license, whether it's an FMA or whatever, that drives an FMP, which is tied to your license. So it is a legal construct. And again, from your FMP, you've got an annual operating plan, which is also tied to your FMP, which is a license requirement, and then your forest harvest. All of those are legally required. So therefore, nothing that's required in an FMP is likely eligible for a carbon project. So for example, if you said, well, I'm planting trees on the landscape, can I get a carbon offset for that? If the answer is you're doing that under an FMP, the answer is no. You can't do that. So anything you do on your landscape because of an FMP, be it retention, be it buffers, you can't get offset credits for that. Next click, please. So what about ownership of carbon? Well, or carbon rights on public land. Who owns the carbon? Well, the Crown owns the carbon. So is there licensing of carbon in addition to timber? That would have to occur if you wanted to get carbon credits public land. So, and will the Crown ask for royalties? So I've done a bit of a dive into the Forest Act, and it's really not set up for this construct of forest carbon. It's really sort of timber focused. Saskatchewan's Act, the Forest Resources Management Act, likely has that ability because they define forest product as opposed to timber, and forest product has a very broad definition of which carbon could fit into. But again, it's a choice. Governments need to make a choice about what they want to do on public land, and maybe they want to encourage this kind of behavior, or maybe not. That remains to be determined. Next click, please. So in my mind, anyway, and I've done a bit of thinking on this, how's that symbiosis of public land between government and industry work? Well, government can't just earn credits on land because they want to, because that business as usual consideration. Anything government does is kind of outside of the bounds of what could be done on a piece of land that's additional. Similarly, industry can't earn offsets because they don't own the credits. So there's got to be some sort of royalty or licensing requirement there. So I think if, at least in my mind, if there is to be offsets on public land, then there needs to be some sort of revenue sharing and ability for industry to do additional things on the landscape and get a benefit for it. So government can't get the offset, industry can't get the offset, but if they work together, there's a high likelihood that some activities will be additional. Next slide, please. Okay, so commoditization of forest carbon. Well, where are we at? In the regulatory compliance market that I described before, with that little graphic of the tier regulation, tons of carbon sell for a discount to the carbon price. So, a company has the option of just paying dollars into a fund or buying an offset. And for that reason, offsets are priced a little bit lower. So that dollar amounts is a bit of a ceiling. In the voluntary market, under ACR, VCS, and ACR being the vast majority of that, the pricing is around $10 to $12 Canadian a ton. And that is increasing. And so I put some stars around that because, as a landowner, what you receive as a sale price for your tons and what might be the retail price is often different because you're receiving wholesale prices depending on the volume. Next slide, please. So, what's driving this? Corporate governance emissions and commitments made by companies are driving the change. There's over 1,500 companies with over $12 trillion in revenue that have net zero targets. In addition to that, there's hundreds of signatories of asset managers with over $43 trillion in assets that have made a commitment to supporting net zero goals. This is driving the market and is what's changing things within the corporate side of things on that voluntary side of market. Next slide, please. So what's happening in that market? Well, the voluntary market transaction volume is increasing rapidly. You can see the volume has almost doubled from 2019 to 2020, and it's likely to double again in 2021. Those numbers are current as of August of this year, and latest numbers are well exceeded $1 billion in value on the voluntary market. The longer term offset demand is likely to see 15 times growth in the next 8 years, and then up to 100 times growth over the next 30 years or 28 years. So by 2050, the market's expected to expand up to 100 times, and over the next 8 years, it's expected to grow by about 15 times from numbers in 2020. And that 2050 number would really be looking at, it's hard to read on the screen, but about 128 gigatons of carbon worth trillions of dollars. So it's a growth industry, and it's growing very, very rapidly. Next slide, please. So the question is a forest product something that the forest produces and can be sold to other industries? Next click. Is it something that produces revenue for landowners? Is it something that could produce revenue for forest licensees? How about something that could return rent to public landowners? Is it renewable? That supports the triple bottom line? Well, my argument is that forest carbon is all of those things, just no different than lumber, no different than OSB, no different than paper. Forest carbon is just a different way of monetizing forest. And for that reason, forest carbon, I believe, is a forest product. So with that, my argument comes full circle, and I'll stop there and see if there's any questions. If you want to click to the next slide, I think I've got a nice little picture of some trees growing in an old forest. So there we are. So perhaps what I'll do is I'll just go back and see if anyone's got any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. That was great. I don't have any questions in here right now, so if any of the attendees do have questions or comments you'd like to get, we'll give you a few minutes here or seconds to kind of fire those into the Q&A or the chat box.
Sure. I do see one question.
One there. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a question: is there room to include soil carbon? Example of preservation of organic soils in this discussion, and the answer is yes. But again, it gets to the delta of what the change is between what your behavior is and what it could be. So soil carbon change, or at least changes in soil carbon due to harvesting, are tied, and I'm not an expert here. I mean, you might be the best person to answer this one. But they're tied to what you do with the biomass on the surface. So if you were to remove all the biomass from a site that you've harvested, then there's going to be some impacts on your soil carbon. If you don't do that, you leave most of the slash behind, then there's less impact. And it's that difference between what you're doing and what that impact is that would create that delta that you can get paid on. Now, forest soil carbon is a huge pool. It's bigger than the other pools of carbon out there. So ideally, it would be wonderful. But current practices leave a lot of biomass behind, and I'm just not sure how much that difference is between what you are doing by preserving the forest and what you would have done by harvesting it. So if there's not much delta, then it's not really worth chasing. The other thing about soil carbon is it's really difficult to measure and expensive to measure. So it's not an easy thing to categorize, but it can be done. And so, protocols are definitely thinking about how you would monetize that, and likely, make it an option so that if your management behavior is such that there is a big delta, that you can capture it.
Perfect. We got another couple of questions here, Dave.
Sure.
So the next one, what do you think would be the best way for Alberta public land to generate carbon offsets?
Okay, so
easy one.
yeah, it's easy. So one needs to think about what is in your FMP, and that's different from licensee to licensee. So one thing that you could do is you could, in your retention targets or in your buffers, leave more behind. And the potential could be that you would be getting a credit for the difference between what you're required to leave behind and anything extra. I know in Saskatchewan, when we did some measurements, and the Saskatchewan rules are very similar to the forest management rules in Alberta, we did an assessment of Weyerhaeuser's land and found that on average, they were leaving more behind than they could have. They were being conservative in achieving those retention targets and their buffer targets. So there is the potential for that being monetized, and over a landscape level, that could add up. In other, like I used the example in another presentation I gave of improved seed. Now I know that's a requirement in many FMPs in Alberta, but in other jurisdictions it's not. And so that would be the lowest fruit. If you could introduce seed that had a better genetic gain that wasn't a requirement of your plan, then that would be probably the easiest and cheapest way to achieve carbon credits on the landscape. So there's a number of those kind of tweaks out there that that could occur. But again, it's sort of that, there's no monetizing unless there's an industry incentive to do it. And so, and that incentive has to come in the form of some sort of financial gain from the carbon credits, which in turn means that you need to have a licensing regime to allow that, which in turn means that you need to have an act that actually does that.
Perfect. That's great. One more there from Andy Bonowitz. Is wood density a factor?
Absolutely. The species mix and the density of the wood that you have is absolutely a factor. So when you're doing your inventory on a carbon project, it's similar to a AVI, Alberta Forest Vegetation, AFVI inventory, but it's sort of on steroids because it measures defect, it measures dead woods, dead standing wood, dead down wood, and a whole suite of other factors that aren't measured within traditional FRI type inventories. So wood density is definitely a factor. Like a hardwood stand is preferable over a softwood stand in terms of a carbon project. It just has more carbon.
Perfect. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I guess we will wrap it up. And thanks, Dave. That was a really good presentation. Again, I really enjoyed it. I'm sure it provided more little food for thought for folks. Different way to think about carbon. So yeah, I will guess we'll close it off right now for this present, and we'll be back to start the next and final presenter for the day, Mike Flanagan, at 2:15. So it's about
before we jump off, though,
sure, yeah,
Hudson, there is one more question in the chat box.
I missed it. Sorry, it just came in.
Yeah, no, it must have come in just now. What do you think might be the royalty in Alberta? And I'd be hesitant to throw that out there, but I think some form of sharing of the value of the credit might be something that could be done, that provides a return to the Crown because the Crown does own the carbon, and provides some incentive for industry as well. But again, that's not my hat, so I wouldn't speculate on how it would actually shake out. But some sort of sharing proportionally would probably be the best way to do it. So with that, I will sign off.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah. So thanks, Dave. Great. Our last break here for the afternoon before the last presentation. We will see everyone back here at 15.
Right on. Thanks for driving, Hudson.
Yeah, no worries. All right. Thanks, guys.